Sometimes the loudest sound in a mansion isn't the echo of wealth, but the crack of injustice. And once it breaks the air, no one can pretend not to hear it. If this story touches you, please subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you healing stories that matter. The afternoon light in Greenwich, Connecticut, slanted low and golden across the riverbank, spilling warmth over the manicured lawns of the Harrington estate. The koi pond shimmered like liquid fire, its surface rippling with each languid movement of the fish beneath. The scent of late summer roses drifted through the air, mingling with the distant hum of cicadas. From afar, it looked like paradise, a life sculpted from privilege and permanence. But within that perfection lay fractures no one dared to name. Grace had felt those fractures since the day she entered the house as a domestic helper. She was 34, her dark skin glowing against her plain cotton dress, her hands calloused from years of labor. She had known loss, the kind that took root in your bones and whispered to you every night. Her only son, Marcus, had died at age 7 from an illness she couldn't afford to treat. Since then, every child's laughter, every baby's cry, pierced her heart with both pain and longing. Perhaps that was why she leaned closer whenever baby Lily, the Harrington's daughter, was near. Lily's small frame, her porcelain cheeks, and her fragile lungs, always at risk of choking when she drank her bottle, reminded Grace that life itself was tender, fragile, a candle flickering in the wind. That day, by the koi pond, Lily sputtered. A sharp cough, a spray of milk, the sound of panic in miniature. Grace reacted instantly, as if by instinct. She scooped the infant gently, placing Lily against her shoulder, tapping her back with steady rhythm. "Come on, baby girl, breathe for me," Grace whispered, rocking slightly, her voice low and warm. And Lily did. A shaky inhale, a cough, then the cry that meant her lungs were clear. Relief softened Grace's features. She kissed the top of Lily's head, tears threatening the corners of her eyes. It was then the slap came. The sound tore through the garden like a gunshot, scattering the koi into sudden shadows beneath the water. Grace staggered back, nearly losing her hold on Lily, whose cry rose into a wail of fear. "You filthy maid!" Victoria's voice cut sharp as glass. "How dare you put your hands on my daughter?" Grace froze. Victoria Harrington, statuesque in a silk dress the color of ivory, towered over her like a marble goddess cracked with fury. The woman's manicured hand still trembled from the blow, her face pale against the dark waves of her hair. Grace's cheek burned, her dignity crumbling with each second of silence. She opened her mouth to explain, but no sound came. "I saw what you were doing," Victoria continued, her voice venomous. "You were clutching her as if she belonged to you, as if you had the right." "She was choking," Grace whispered, her throat thick with humiliation. "I was only trying to—" "To what? To steal her affection? To remind us of your tragedy?" Victoria's words fell like knives. "Don't think I don't know your type. You people always overstep." Grace's knees weakened, but she held Lily tighter, shielding the baby from the storm of anger above her. Her heart bled with the accusation, "You people." She had heard those words in hospitals that turned her away, in schools where her son had been overlooked, in every corner of a country that promised freedom but rarely offered it equally. Footsteps echoed on the marble walkway. James Harrington emerged from the French doors, the gleam of his tailored suit catching the late light. At 42, he was handsome in the austere way of men who measured life in contracts and quarterly reports. CEO of one of Manhattan's most influential investment funds, he carried power the way others carried air. "What's happening here?" James's voice was cool, but a crease of irritation marred his forehead. "Your maid was manhandling our daughter," Victoria spat before Grace could speak. "I caught her clutching Lily as if she owned her." Grace turned, desperate. "Mr. Harrington, she was choking." But James's gaze was already cold. His world had no patience for servants who crossed boundaries. He had grown up among rules and appearances, where every scandal cost millions. His trust in his wife, despite the cracks in their marriage, outweighed his belief in the word of an employee. "Grace," he said, his tone sharp, final. "Put her down. You will not touch Lily again without permission." The words sliced deeper than the slap. Grace's chest tightened, her breath uneven. She bent to place Lily back in Victoria's arms, but the baby twisted, reaching toward Grace, her tiny fists clutching air as if to say, "Don't go." Victoria sneered, shifting Lily against her silk shoulder. "See? She's manipulating even the child." Grace lowered her eyes. Her throat burned with words she dared not speak. James's jaw flexed. "If you cannot respect the boundaries of this household, you should reconsider your position here." It was then Victoria's hand shoved forward, swift, deliberate. Grace gasped as her body stumbled, the ground tilting beneath her. She hit the edge of the koi pond and fell, water swallowing her with icy force. The world became bubbles, reeds, the flash of koi scattering in terror. Her dress tangled around her legs, the sting of humiliation searing hotter than the cold water. She surfaced, coughing, her braids dripping, her skin clammy with shame. Above her, Victoria clutched Lily to her chest, her smile cruel, her posture triumphant. James stood beside her, silent, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of doubt darkened his eyes. Grace dragged herself from the water, each step heavier than the last, her soaked dress clinging to her like chains. She could not meet their eyes. She could not erase the mark of the slap still blooming across her cheek. For a moment, the estate seemed to shrink around her. The sprawling mansion, the gardens, the polished life, all of it was a gilded cage she had stumbled into, never belonging, never safe. And yet, in the midst of her humiliation, a single thought burned steady in her chest. "I will not abandon Lily, not while she still needs me." Grace walked back toward the servants' quarters, her shoes squelching with each step. Behind her, the pond shimmered again, its beauty restored. But the silence it carried was no longer peace. It was the silence of injustice, heavy and waiting to break. The nights in the Harrington estate were not like the nights Grace had known in her small apartment on the outskirts of Bridgeport. There, the hum of the highway and the occasional siren were the backdrop of her grief. Here, silence reigned like a monarch, thick, oppressive, broken only by the creak of old oak floors and the whisper of the river against the banks outside. Grace lay in her narrow bed in the servants' wing, her body sore from the slap, her skin chilled from the koi pond. The memory replayed again and again, each detail etched in her mind. Victoria's raised hand, James's cold dismissal, the water swallowing her dignity. Sleep would not come. At midnight, she rose. She often wandered the hallways when the household fell silent. Walking in the dark, hearing only her breath and the ticking of distant clocks, gave her a strange comfort. Tonight, though, her feet carried her without thought toward the grand hallway outside the master suites. The marble underfoot was cold. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the diffusers Victoria insisted Samuel, the butler, refill daily. Chandeliers overhead lay dormant, leaving only the silver light of the moon spilling through high-arched windows. And then, voices. She froze, pressed against the wall, breath shallow. It was Victoria. Grace would have recognized that smooth, commanding tone anywhere. But her words were hushed, softer, threaded with something dangerous. "You said you would talk to him soon." A man's voice answered, low, weighted with impatience. "Not yet. He's too cautious right now, but trust me, he'll believe anything you say. He always has." Grace's chest tightened. She leaned closer to the gilded column that shielded her view, peering around its edge. Victoria stood in her satin robe, hair loose over her shoulders, and beside her, Robert. Grace's stomach sank. She knew Robert. Everyone in the house did. He was James's closest friend. His confidant since college, the man who had sat at their dining table dozens of times. Tall, broad-shouldered, always smiling with the charisma of a politician. James trusted him with investments, with counsel, with secrets. Now, Grace saw him differently. The way his hand lingered at Victoria's waist. The way her lips curved in a smile not of friendship, but of possession. The hallway air thickened. Grace stepped back into the shadows, heart hammering. She didn't want to see more, yet she couldn't look away. Robert leaned close, his whisper audible in the hush of the estate. "If he finds out we're finished, we need to play this carefully." Victoria laughed quietly, the sound sharp, bitter. "He'll never know unless she opens her mouth." Grace's breath caught. She realized instantly. Victoria was speaking of her. Victoria tilted her head, eyes glinting in the dim. "She saw me slap her today. She saw me push her. And she saw this." Victoria's hand brushed Robert's chest. "If she ever talks, it's over." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then make sure she doesn't talk." Grace pressed both palms against her skirt to keep them from trembling. A sick dread swirled inside her. She backed away, one step at a time, careful not to let the old floors betray her with a creak. When she finally reached the corridor to the servants' wing, she exhaled the breath she'd been holding. Her mind raced. She had witnessed something irreversible. She had seen not just betrayal, but conspiracy. One that threatened to devour her if she was not careful. In the solitude of her room, Grace sat on the bed, burying her face in her hands. The memories of Marcus, her son, rose unbidden. He had been everything, her pride, her joy, her reason. When he fell ill with pneumonia, she had begged the clinics for help, offered to clean their floors if they would only admit him. But policies and prejudice closed the doors. She held him in her arms when his breath faltered, when his eyes closed for the last time. Now, in Lily's tiny frame, Grace saw Marcus's shadow. She saw the second chance she was never given. Lily was not her daughter, yet every fiber of her being longed to protect her. But protecting her meant silence. If she exposed Victoria's affair, James might fire her on the spot. If she stayed silent, she would become complicit in the lie. Worse still, Victoria might twist her silence into guilt. Already the slap and the shove into the pond had proven how far Victoria would go to keep power. Grace wept quietly, her shoulders shaking. She prayed, not for herself, but for Lily. When dawn came, Grace's eyes were swollen from tears, but her decision still eluded her. Should she confront James? Should she tell the truth? At breakfast, the air in the Harrington dining room was a theater of pretense. Victoria sat regal at the head of the table, Lily in a high chair beside her. James read the Wall Street Journal, his coffee untouched. Robert, bold enough to join them early, sipped his espresso with the casual charm of a man who had nothing to hide. Grace, carrying a tray of fresh fruit, felt the weight of the night pressing against her ribs. Her gaze met Victoria's for a fraction of a second. In those green eyes, she saw not fear, but calculation. And a warning. Stay silent, or you will regret it. Grace lowered her head. She served the fruit, her hands steady though her soul trembled. James looked up briefly. His eyes flickered toward Grace, cold, unreadable. Then he turned the page of his paper, dismissing her existence. As she retreated to the kitchen, Grace caught sight of Lily reaching again, toward her, not toward Victoria. The baby's tiny hand stretched as if begging for the comfort of the woman who had saved her life only yesterday. Grace felt her heart break all over again. In that moment, she made a vow in silence. I will endure. I will survive her cruelty. I will not let this child suffer the way Marcus did. What Grace did not know was that her endurance would soon become the very weapon Victoria feared most. The city of Manhattan glittered like a jeweled crown across the Hudson, its skyline sharp against the morning haze. James Harrington had long believed that numbers never lied: balance sheets, quarterly earnings, investment returns. To him, data was truth. And truth was currency. Emotions were weak variables, unreliable, dangerous. But back in Greenwich, in the quiet estate by the river, truth was shifting under his very roof, and no spreadsheet could explain it. Grace rose early, though her body ached with weariness. She moved quietly through the servants' wing, tying her apron, smoothing her braids into a neat bun. Her cheek still carried the faint shadow of Victoria's slap, though the pond water was long dried. The wound beneath the skin, however, remained raw. She carried linens through the hallway, careful not to meet Victoria's gaze at breakfast. Robert was gone that morning, summoned to the city for business. James sat at the head of the table, his paper folded neatly beside his coffee. His eyes swept over Grace once, cold, before settling back on the newsprint. Grace's heart beat fast. She wanted to speak, to defend herself. But the memory of Victoria's words in the hallway, "Make sure she doesn't talk," silenced her. She lowered her head and continued her duties. It was Samuel, the butler, who noticed first. Samuel had served the Harrington family for 3 decades. Stoic, discreet, he was the keeper of the estate's rhythms. He knew every creak of the stair, every shadow of the garden. He also knew Victoria's temper and the quiet dangers it carried. That morning, as Grace passed him in the service corridor, Samuel paused. His gray eyes studied her cheek, the way she moved with hesitance. "Miss Grace," he murmured when no one else was near. "It's not my place, but I saw the pond. I saw what she did." Grace stiffened. "Please," she whispered, "don't speak of it. For Lily's sake." Samuel's jaw clenched. He lowered his voice further. "There are cameras. The estate is lined with them for security, one by the pond. I checked the feed this morning." Grace's breath caught. What did it show?" Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. "The truth. That you saved the child. That she struck you, then pushed you into the water." Grace swayed, her knees nearly giving. For the first time since the slap, relief flickered inside her chest. Proof. Evidence stronger than words. But Samuel's eyes darkened. "I copied it before Mrs. Harrington could have it erased. Mr. Harrington needs to see this. Yet—" He paused, his loyalty warring with caution. "He is a man who sees what he chooses. Sometimes even truth must fight to be believed." That afternoon, James returned from the city earlier than usual. He walked through the foyer, his tie loosened, his phone pressed to his ear. Grace hovered near the staircase, debating whether to slip away. Samuel approached him calmly, carrying a small flash drive in his gloved hand. "Sir, a moment of your time." James frowned, ending his call. "What is it, Samuel?" "There's something you should see." James followed him into the study, the heavy oak door closing behind them. Grace lingered outside, heart pounding, unable to resist the urge to listen. Inside, Samuel inserted the drive into the computer. The screen glowed, then played. The koi pond appeared, sunlight shimmering. Grace stood with Lily in her arms, patting her back gently. The baby coughed, cried, then breathed again. Grace kissed her head, relief etched across her face. Then, Victoria entered. The slap cracked through the speakers, even on the grainy recording. The shove. Grace's fall into the pond. James leaned forward, his hand tightening around the desk edge. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. The video ended. Silence fell. Samuel spoke carefully. "She was saving the child, sir. Nothing more." James inhaled sharply, his mind a storm. Data did not lie. Cameras did not lie. And yet, how easily he had believed Victoria, how quickly he had condemned Grace. "Leave us, Samuel," he said, his voice low. Samuel bowed and exited. Grace, startled, nearly collided with him in the hallway. He gave her a brief, knowing look before disappearing into the shadows. Inside the study, James remained still. His chest rose and fell heavily. For a man who dealt daily with billions, betrayal was not new. But betrayal within his own home cut deeper than any hostile takeover. When he finally opened the door, Grace stood there, trembling. "You knew," James said, his eyes fixed on her. Grace's throat tightened. "I tried to tell you. She was choking. I would never harm her." James's face hardened. A battle raging inside him, he wanted to apologize, to admit his mistake, but vulnerability had no place in his world. Instead, his anger shifted, deflecting. "You should have come to me immediately," he snapped. "You should have insisted until I listened. Instead, you hid in silence." Grace's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Would you have believed me, sir? When you looked at me yesterday, I saw it in your eyes. Nothing I said would have mattered." The truth in her words stung sharper than any insult. James turned away, pacing the study, his hands clenched. He despised the weakness rising in him, the shame of having misjudged. "Go," he ordered finally, his voice cold. "Return to your duties." Grace bowed her head, her dignity shredded anew. She left the study, though her heart screamed with frustration. Even with the truth laid bare, she was still the scapegoat. James sank into his leather chair once she was gone. He pressed his hands to his face. The image of Victoria striking Grace, shoving her into the pond, replayed endlessly. The image of Robert's easy smile at dinner burned beside it. He had always trusted numbers, not people. But now the numbers were silent, and the people closest to him were liars. That night, he returned late from Manhattan. In the nursery, Lily stirred in her crib, restless. Grace, assigned to watch her, hummed softly, a lullaby she once sang to Marcus. James paused at the doorway, unseen. The melody drifted like smoke, warm and sorrowful. Lily calmed, her tiny fingers clutching the blanket. Grace's face softened in the dim light, eyes glistening with unspoken love. James stood there, something inside him fracturing. He had seen the footage. He had heard Grace's words, yet admitting his error meant unraveling the fragile order of his life. So he turned away, retreating into silence. But the camera never lied, and the longer he ignored its truth, the more dangerous the lie beside him became. The Harrington estate, with its marble halls and crystal chandeliers, seemed to breathe in whispers at night. Wealth was meant to shield against scandal, to muffle truth behind layers of velvet and stone. But within those walls, betrayal had begun to stir, like a draft no insulation could keep out. Grace moved silently through the corridors, carrying fresh linens toward the nursery. The shadows lengthened. The river wind pressed against the glass windows, and every creak of the house felt like a secret trying to escape. She had not slept much since the night she'd witnessed Victoria and Robert in the hallway. The images haunted her. Victoria's satin robe, Robert's hand at her waist, the hissed promise to keep James blind. Every morning she resolved to keep silent, to survive for Lily's sake. But silence grew heavier each day, pressing against her ribs like a stone. James, too, was restless. He had watched the koi pond footage half a dozen times. It played in his head whenever Victoria's laugh sounded too sweet, whenever Robert's smile stretched too wide. He had built his empire on trust. Trust in data, trust in projections, trust in Robert. Yet now, even the numbers on his spreadsheets seemed tainted by shadows of doubt. One evening, Grace found herself in the library, dusting shelves of books rarely opened. She startled when James entered. He looked weary. His tie loosened, his hair disheveled from running his hand through it. His eyes, usually sharp with calculation, now carried a fog of unease. "Grace," he said quietly. She froze, clutching her duster like a shield. "Yes, sir?" James hesitated, then closed the door behind him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "You saw something," he said finally, his voice low. "Something you haven't told me." Grace's heart thundered. Her fingers tightened on the duster. She thought of Lily, of Marcus, of her vow to endure. But something in James's gaze, a crack in his certainty, pushed her toward the truth. "Yes," she whispered. "I did." James stepped closer. "Tell me." Grace swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "I saw Mrs. Harrington with Mr. Robert in the hallway, late at night." The words hung in the air like smoke. James's face went pale, then tightened into steel. "What exactly did you see?" His tone carried the sharpness of cross-examination, of a man who had built boardrooms on the power of precise language. Grace's voice trembled. "I saw her in his arms. I saw his hand at her waist. I heard them speaking about deceiving you, about me, about making sure I stayed silent." For a moment, James said nothing. His jaw worked, his breath uneven. 20 years of friendship with Robert, college roommates, business partners, godfather to Lily, balanced on the edge of Grace's words. "You realize what you're saying," he muttered, pacing the carpet. He's been with me through everything. Deals, crises, losses. He's the one man I've trusted without question." Grace lowered her eyes. "I know what I saw, and I know what I heard." James turned on her, anger flashing. "Do you understand the damage an accusation like this can do? If you're wrong, I am not wrong." Grace's voice, for once, did not tremble. She lifted her chin, her eyes wet but fierce. "You can doubt me, sir. You have doubted me before. But the truth doesn't bend just because you wish it to." Her defiance stunned him into silence. For the first time, James saw not just a servant, but a woman scarred by loss, carrying strength born of suffering. He turned away, his hands shaking. "I need proof," he said finally, almost to himself. "Numbers, evidence. I cannot. I will not act on whispers." Grace exhaled slowly. She had given him the truth. Whether he used it was no longer hers to control. That night, James lay awake beside Victoria. She slept soundly, her face serene in the moonlight. He studied her profile, the curve of her lips, the woman he had married with vows of permanence. But her image blurred with the footage of the slap, with Grace's trembling words, with the memory of Robert's hand shaking his at business dinners. The next morning, James summoned Samuel to his study. "There are blind spots in this house," James said. "I want cameras installed. Every hallway, every room, if possible." Samuel raised his brows but asked no questions. Very well, sir. And discreetly, James added. No one, not even Mrs. Harrington, must know. Samuel inclined his head. Understood. Thus began the quiet war. While Victoria planned luncheons and charity galas, James planned surveillance. While Robert laughed with him over bourbon at the club, James measured each smile, each gesture, with suspicion. He became a man split in two, the trusting friend and the calculating hunter. Grace noticed the change. She saw him linger in doorways, his eyes distant. She saw the tension in his shoulders when Robert entered a room. She saw, too, how Victoria grew sharper, more defensive, as though she sensed the net closing in. One evening at dinner, the air was electric. Victoria spoke brightly about an upcoming gala in Manhattan. Robert, seated beside her, chimed in with jokes and anecdotes. James nodded, smiled faintly, but his eyes never left them. Serving roasted lamb at the sideboard, felt the tension coil tighter with each passing minute. She could almost hear the chessboard moving beneath the table, every word a piece sliding into place. Later, as she cleared the plates, Grace passed close to James. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. His were cold steel, but beneath the frost she glimpsed a fire, anger, betrayal, resolve. She knew then that the war was no longer hers to fight. It was his. But wars fought in silence could be the most dangerous of all. The dining room of the Harrington estate was a gallery of old New England elegance. Heavy mahogany chairs, a long polished table, and portraits of Harrington ancestors lining the walls, men in powdered wigs, women in lace collars, all staring down as if to judge the living. A chandelier glowed above, each crystal dripping with light like icicles of fire. It was here that truths were never spoken plainly, only acted out beneath silverware and candlelight. That evening, Victoria arranged a family dinner. Only James, Grace, and Robert would be present, though she insisted Samuel set the table with the finest china, as though preparing for royalty. Her voice carried through the halls with false sweetness. We must all spend time together as a family. Isn't that right, darling? James said nothing, only nodded. He had already instructed Samuel where to place the hidden cameras. They now watched from the corners of the dining room, tiny eyes in the shadows. Grace, while laying out crystal glasses, caught sight of one, no larger than a pinhole in the crown molding. She realized then that the room itself had become a stage, and every gesture tonight would be recorded. When the dinner began, the air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, thyme, and red wine. Victoria entered in a gown of emerald silk, a diamond pendant gleaming at her throat. She smiled as though nothing had ever been broken, as though her hand had never struck, her lips had never lied. Robert followed, his presence filling the room like smoke. He wore his usual charm, leaning close to kiss Victoria's cheek, too brief to be scandalous, too intimate to be innocent. Then he turned to James, clasping his shoulder in that old, easy way. Good to see you, brother. James's jaw tightened, but his lips curved faintly. Always. Grace moved quietly along the edges. Serving dishes, pouring wine. Her heart raced with every glance exchanged between Victoria and Robert. She saw the flicker of amusement in their eyes, the subtle brush of fingers as Robert passed the breadbasket. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing. But to her, it was a language, a dangerous one. Victoria lifted her glass. To family, she said brightly, and to friendships that endure. Robert echoed, raising his glass toward James. 20 years, brother. We've built empires together. Here's to 20 more. James's glass touched theirs with a soft clink. His smile was steady, but his knuckles whitened against the stem. The meal unfolded like a chess match. Every course, every toast, every polite word was a move upon the board. Victoria laughed too freely at Robert's jokes. Robert spoke of deals in Manhattan, of new ventures, of trust funds that promised untold returns. James listened, his mind racing behind calm eyes. Grace, circling with the serving tray, felt as though she carried more than food. She carried witness. Every moment burned itself into her memory. At one point, Lily's cry echoed faintly from the nursery upstairs. Grace instinctively paused, looking toward the door. Victoria waved her off sharply. "The nanny will handle it. Sit, Grace, and let the professionals work." James glanced at Grace then, just for a heartbeat. He saw the way her hands trembled, the way her eyes longed to comfort the child. And for the first time he realized Grace's love was never performance. It was pure, the one honest thing in this masquerade. "Tell me, Robert," James said suddenly, his tone too casual. "What keeps you up at night these days? Surely not market fluctuations. You've always slept well through storms." Robert chuckled, leaning back. "You know me, James. Nothing rattles me. Not when I've got partners like you watching my back." Victoria's hand brushed Robert's under the table. Grace saw it, though James pretended not to. Instead, James cut a piece of duck and spoke evenly. "Trust, Robert. That's what keeps me up at night. Knowing whether the people closest to me truly have my back or whether they're waiting for the right moment to slip a knife between my ribs." The words landed like a blade on the table. The chandelier seemed to flicker. Victoria froze mid-bite, her smile faltering. Robert gave a short laugh, but it was brittle, his eyes darting quickly to Victoria before returning to James. "You've always been dramatic," Robert said. "Maybe," James replied, his gaze steady. "Or maybe I've just learned that masks are common, even in familiar rooms." Grace's chest tightened. She sensed the trap closing. James was no longer blind. He was playing the game now, moving his pieces with precision. Victoria recovered quickly, laughing lightly. "Darling, you really mustn't bring business paranoia into our dining room. Tonight is about family." James's eyes did not leave hers. "Family," he echoed, his voice colder than the wine in his glass. The rest of the dinner unfolded under that shadow. Conversation continued, but the air was brittle, each word weighed and measured. Grace cleared dishes, her heart pounding, certain that the mansion itself could feel the storm brewing. When the final course was served, James raised his glass again. His smile was practiced, his voice calm. "To masks," he said softly. "May they always hide what they must, until the day they are torn away." Victoria's glass clinked against his, her hand steady though her eyes flickered with unease. Robert raised his as well, but his jaw was tight. Grace watched silently. She knew then that the battle lines had been drawn. Tonight was no longer dinner. It was war dressed in silk and silver. As the candles burned lower, James excused himself, pressing a kiss to Lily's sleeping forehead in the nursery. Victoria lingered with Robert, whispering, though now the cameras caught every syllable. Grace passed the doorway later and saw James in the study, staring at the monitor, his eyes sharp as steel. The dinner had ended. The game had begun. The study in the Harrington estate had always been James's fortress. Dark oak panels rose high around shelves of law tomes and investment reports. An antique globe rested in the corner, and behind the desk, a portrait of his father, stern-eyed, as if watching over every decision. For James, this room was not merely a space. It was a vault of power, a chamber where numbers dictated truth and strategy shaped destiny. Yet now, truth itself had slipped through his fingers. The night after the dinner of masks, James lingered here long after Victoria and Robert had retired. On the monitor, the hidden cameras replayed subtle gestures and hushed glances. The evidence was mounting, though incomplete. He needed more, proof no courtroom or boardroom could dispute. Grace entered quietly, balancing a silver tray with tea. Her presence startled him. He had forgotten he'd summoned her. "Leave it there," he said, his voice low. But Grace did not leave. She hesitated, then spoke. "Mr. Harrington, you will not find peace in shadows. You must pull truth into the light." James looked at her, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "You presume much?" "I see much," she replied softly. Her gaze shifted to the painting of his father. "I know what it is to live in the shadow of expectation. But children," her voice trembled, "children deserve parents who stand in truth, not in masks." James's chest tightened, though he said nothing. It was then Samuel appeared at the door, his expression grave. "Sir, there is something you should see. The safe in the East study. I believe Mrs. Harrington keeps documents there." James frowned. "That safe has been sealed for years." "Not anymore," Samuel said quietly. "I've seen her enter it." Silence stretched. James rose, buttoned his jacket, and motioned to Grace. "Come. If there is truth to be found, you will witness it with me." The East study was smaller, tucked behind the library. Dust hung heavy in the air, disturbed only by recent footsteps. Against the far wall stood the safe, a heavy steel relic inherited from his grandfather. James knelt, his fingers moving with the precision of habit. He remembered the code. It had not changed in decades. 4279. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Inside lay stacks of cash bound with ribbons, envelopes bulging with documents, and beneath them, photographs. Grace gasped. She stepped closer, her eyes widening. The first photo showed Victoria and Robert together in a Manhattan penthouse suite, her lips against his, their bodies entwined. Others followed. Dinners, embraces, moments meant to be hidden. But worse still were the financial documents. James's eyes scanned line after line, his heart pounding. Wire transfers, trust fund withdrawals, forged signatures. The family's multi-generational trust, money meant for Lily's future, had been siphoned into offshore accounts. Then, at the bottom of the pile, a small USB drive. James inserted it into the laptop on the desk, the screen lit with spreadsheets, emails, financial statements, all detailing fraud. Each line was a nail in the coffin of his marriage and his partnership with Robert. Grace, standing beside him, whispered, "They were stealing from Lily." James's throat constricted. Betrayal in business he could withstand. Betrayal of his daughter he could not forgive. But there was more. Grace's hands trembled as she picked up a final envelope. Inside was a photograph, herself, holding Lily on her hip in the garden. Scrawled across the bottom in Victoria's handwriting were 3 words. "Use this later." Grace's knees buckled. She means to accuse me. To say I wanted to steal her child." The room spun around her. All at once, the slap by the pond, the threats in the hallway, the cruel looks. It all wove into one sinister pattern. Victoria was not content to betray James. She meant to destroy Grace entirely. James's fury erupted, his fist slamming against the desk. "She would frame you to protect herself." His eyes blazed, veins rising in his temples. "She would damn you to prison to preserve her lie." Grace's tears spilled freely. "She already sees me as guilty, because of my skin, because of my place in this house. No one will believe me." James turned to her sharply. "I will." It was the first time he had spoken those words to her. His voice shook with conviction, the iron certainty of a man who had finally chosen a side. But even as the words settled, a sound echoed from the hallway, the faint creak of a floorboard. Samuel stiffened. He opened the study door, but the corridor was empty. Still, the silence felt dangerous, as though unseen ears had heard everything. "Seal the safe," James ordered. "Not a word leaves this room, not until I decide how to strike." Grace closed the safe with trembling hands, but her mind swirled. She thought of Marcus, her son taken by poverty, by indifference. She thought of Lily, the innocent child whose future was now tangled in betrayal. James paced the room like a predator, his thoughts calculating. The cameras gave him fragments, the safe gave him substance. Now he needed timing, a trap carefully set to expose Victoria and Robert before the law, before the world. Grace, watching him, saw not only anger, but pain. His empire, his marriage, his friendship, all poisoned. For the first time, she realized James was not invincible. He was human, broken by betrayal. When the night ended, Grace returned to her quarters, clutching the photograph of herself and Lily. The words "use this" later burned into her mind. She sat on her bed, whispering a prayer. "Lord, protect this child. Protect her from the sins of those who should love her most." Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Victoria stirred awake. The faintest smile curved her lips. She suspected James had begun to doubt, but she had plans, layers of them, masks upon masks. And if Grace dared to cross her again, Victoria would ensure the maid's fall was permanent. For now, the safe was closed. But secrets, once unearthed, could never be buried again. The nursery had always been the gentlest place in the Harrington estate. Its walls were painted a soft shade of blue, adorned with watercolor paintings of clouds and fields. A rocking chair rested near the window, its rhythm usually a balm against the chaos of the world. The air carried the faint scent of lavender, chosen to soothe a child into sleep. But on that night, the nursery was no sanctuary. It was a stage for cruelty. Grace had just finished folding Lily's blankets when she heard the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor. Victoria entered without knocking, Robert close behind her. Their faces were masks of urgency, their voices hushed but sharp. "There," Victoria hissed, pointing at Grace. "We'll end this tonight." Grace stiffened, instinctively moving closer to the crib. Lily stirred, her small hand twitching in dreams. Grace's chest tightened with the protective impulse that had grown stronger with each passing day. "What are you doing?" Grace asked, her voice steady but low. Robert shut the door behind them, the lock clicking into place. "Making sure James finally sees you for what you are." Victoria stepped forward, her eyes glinting like polished steel. In her hand she held a silver rattle. She raised it high, then let it slip deliberately to the floor beside Grace's foot. The clatter echoed through the room. "Perfect," Victoria whispered. "Now scream." Grace's breath caught. She realized with horror what they intended, to stage a scene, to claim she had been caught harming Lily. "James!" Victoria cried suddenly, her voice shrill, rehearsed. "Help! She's hurting the baby!" Grace froze, panic surging through her veins. "No! I would never!" Robert lunged forward, shoving Grace back from the crib. She stumbled, her hip striking the rocking chair. The chair tipped, hitting the wall with a thud. Lily woke with a frightened cry, her wail piercing the air. Victoria clutched the child, rocking her dramatically, tears springing to her eyes on command. "Look at her, Robert! She almost—" The door burst open. James stood there, his face pale but fierce, Samuel at his side. For a split second, the scene was exactly as Victoria wanted. Grace standing accused, the rattle at her feet, Lily crying in her mother's arms. But then, the faint click. From the corner of the nursery, a small red light blinked on a hidden camera. James's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of thunder. "Continue," he said coldly. "Don't stop your performance on my account." Victoria froze, her act faltering. "James, she tried to—" "Enough!" He raised a hand, his jaw like granite. "I've seen enough." Robert's face blanched. "You can't believe her over us." James's gaze was like ice. "Believe? I don't need to believe. I know. The camera records more faithfully than any heart ever could." He stepped into the room, towering over them. His eyes burned not just with anger, but with a pain deeper than Grace could have imagined. 20 years of trust, a marriage, a friendship, all shattering in the glow of that blinking red light. Grace trembled, tears streaming down her cheeks. She sank to her knees beside the crib, whispering softly to Lily, who still wailed. "Shh, baby girl. You're safe." Victoria's mask cracked. Her voice, sharp and venomous, tore through the air. "She wants to replace me, James. Don't you see? She's wormed her way into your pity, into Lily's heart." James's voice thundered. "And you would use our child as a weapon?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Robert shifted uneasily, his bravado gone. Victoria's lips trembled, but she held herself rigid, still clinging to the pretense of control. James turned to Samuel. "Call the attorney." "Tonight, and prepare the staff. Mrs. Harrington and her guest will be leaving." Samuel bowed slightly, already moving with purpose. Grace, still by the crib, dared to look up at James. For the first time, his gaze softened when it fell on her. "You've carried the weight of their cruelty too long," he said quietly. "It ends now." Victoria's face twisted with rage. "You'll regret this, James. I'll take everything. The house, the company, Lily." James's jaw hardened. "Not Lily." "Never Lily." Robert finally found his voice, desperate. "James, listen. This is business. We can fix this. We can bury it." James turned to him, his voice like iron. "You buried yourself the moment you stepped into my home with lies on your lips. You are no partner. You are no friend." Robert's shoulders sagged, his arrogance collapsing into silence. Victoria clutched Lily tighter, but the child twisted away, her little arms reaching toward Grace. The gesture broke what little remained of the room's charade. Grace rose slowly, her heart trembling as Lily nestled against her shoulder once more. In that moment, every false mask fell, and the truth was undeniable. The child knew who had truly loved her. James's eyes glistened, though he fought to remain composed. "This is over," he said. "Tomorrow the law will have its say. But tonight, you will not spend another hour in this house." Victoria's fury dissolved into a silence sharper than any scream. She set Lily back in the crib, her fingers trembling. Then, with Robert beside her, she walked toward the door, her heels striking the floor like nails driven into wood. The nursery fell quiet again. The rocking chair swayed gently from Grace's earlier fall, its rhythm a soft lull in the aftermath of chaos. James exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "They thought they could trap you, but they trapped themselves." Grace, holding Lily's tiny hand in hers, nodded. She had been moments from ruin, but the truth had spoken louder. The fire of war was no longer smoldering. It burned now, clear and fierce. And tomorrow it would light the halls of justice. The night fell heavy on Greenwich, pressing shadows against the grand estate. The mansion's chandeliers glowed like watchful eyes, their light spilling across marble floors polished to mirror brightness. Silence hung thick, broken only by the faint creak of the house settling in the wind off the river. But beneath that silence, tension thrummed like the strings of a violin pulled taut. waiting for the bow to strike. James had planned carefully. For weeks he had lived a double life, smiling at Robert, nodding at Victoria, all while setting cameras, saving files, preparing a noose woven not of rope but of evidence. The koi pond, the hallway whispers, the forged transfers, the damning photograph of Grace, they were pieces of a puzzle he had assembled in silence. Now it was time to reveal the picture. He summoned them to the drawing room just past dusk. The fire burned low in the hearth, its flames licking the logs with quiet menace. Heavy drapes shut out the night, cocooning them in a chamber that felt less like a family room and more like a courtroom. Victoria entered first, dressed immaculately in cream silk, her diamonds catching the firelight. She moved with the grace of a queen, certain of her throne. Robert followed, his tailored suit sharp, his smile confident. Grace lingered near the doorway, hesitant, clutching her hands together. Samuel stood discreetly at the back, his gray eyes steady as stone. James remained at the center, beside the grand desk. He looked neither at Victoria nor Robert, but at the laptop that waited silently, screen dark.
"Why are we here?"
Victoria asked, her voice bright but edged.
"This feels rather formal."
James's gaze lifted, cold and sharp. "Because it is." Robert chuckled, stepping forward. "Brother, if this is about business, we can handle it at the office. No need for theatrics." James's lips curved faintly, but his eyes were ice. "Sit." Something in his tone, the steel beneath it, compelled obedience. They sat. Victoria crossed her legs, one diamond shoe swinging lightly, as though she were bored. James pressed a key on the laptop. The screen lit, projecting onto the wall. And there, grainy but undeniable, appeared the koi pond footage. Grace's breath caught. On screen, she cradled Lily, tapping her back as the child choked. Then came Victoria. The slap, the shove, Grace falling into the water. Lily's cry filled the room, echoing against the walls. Victoria stiffened. Robert's smile faltered. James spoke evenly. "The camera never lies. For weeks, I chose not to believe what was before my eyes. That ends tonight." Victoria forced a laugh. "James, really? That footage could be taken out of context. She was clutching Lily. It looked dangerous." "Enough!" James's voice cracked like a whip. The word echoed through the chamber, silencing even the fire's crackle. He pressed another key. More footage played. The hidden camera from the east hallway. Victoria, in her robe, Robert's hand at her waist. Their whispers carried through the speakers. "He'll never know unless she talks." Victoria's face drained of color. Robert shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. James stepped closer, his eyes burning. 20 years, Robert. I trusted you with my company, my daughter, my life. And you repay me with betrayal." Robert opened his mouth, but James raised a hand. "Do not lie. Not tonight." The next file appeared, documents from the USB drive, spreadsheets, transfers, signatures forged. The siphoning of the trust fund, every figure, every dollar, projected in cold, undeniable detail. Grace pressed a hand to her lips. Samuel's eyes glimmered with grim satisfaction. James's voice dropped, quieter but sharper. "You stole from Lily, from my daughter's future, and you—" He turned to Victoria, his voice like iron. "You plotted to frame an innocent woman, a woman who has shown this child more love than her own mother." Victoria's composure cracked. She rose abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "You dare accuse me? After all I've given you, this home, this reputation, you'd throw it all away on the word of a servant?" Grace flinched at the word, but James did not. He straightened, taller, stronger, his voice steady. "No, on the word of the truth, on the word of evidence, On the word of justice. Victoria's mask shattered. Her voice sharpened into venom.
She wants your sympathy, James. She wants to replace me.
Stop. James's tone silenced her. He turned toward Grace. Grace, come forward. She stepped slowly, her knees weak. He looked at her, not as master to servant, but as man to equal. You saved my daughter, and I doubted you. For that, I was blind. Tonight, I will not be blind again. Grace's eyes brimmed, her voice trembling. All I ever wanted was to protect her. Lily deserves truth. She deserves love, not lies. James faced Victoria and Robert. I will not allow either of you near her again. As of tonight,
You are finished here. Victoria gasped. You can't. I can. And I will. The attorneys already have these files. A restraining order will be filed tonight. Tomorrow the world will know the truth. Robert surged to his feet, fury replacing charm. You'll destroy everything, James. The company, the trust, your own name. No, James said coldly. You destroyed them the moment you betrayed me. I am merely cleaning the ruins. For the first time, Robert had no words. His fists clenched. His jaw worked, but he remained silent. Victoria's fury turned desperate. James, think of Lily. Think of appearances. You'll drag her through scandal. James's gaze was fire. Better scandal than lies. Better truth than a life poisoned by masks. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the portraits on the walls seemed to lean closer, watching the reckoning unfold. Finally, James turned to Samuel. See them out. Tonight. Their belongings will follow under guard. Samuel bowed. His face calm but resolute. He gestured toward the door. Victoria glared, her diamond pendant trembling against her throat. Robert's eyes burned, but he knew the fight was lost. They walked out, their footsteps echoing like the retreat of defeated generals. When the door shut, the weight of the house shifted. The air seemed clearer, though the ashes of betrayal still smoldered. James exhaled heavily. He turned to Grace, his voice softening. You should never have suffered what you did. And yet you stood. You endured. For Lily, for truth.
Grace lowered her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. I had no choice. When you've lost a child, you know every other child must be protected. James's chest ached. He had lost more than he realized, not only trust, but humanity. And Grace had reminded him of it. He nodded slowly. Tonight begins the end. Tomorrow, the reckoning. The fire crackled in the hearth, brighter now, as though feeding on the truth spoken aloud. And for the first time in weeks, James felt the faintest taste of freedom, not from betrayal, but from the silence that had imprisoned him. The courthouse in New Haven loomed like a stone sentinel against the gray morning sky. Its columns rose in stern silence, its steps slick with rain. Reporters clustered at the entrance, their cameras poised, voices crackling with anticipation. The Harrington scandal had spilled into the world, and now the world demanded spectacle. James walked up the steps with his attorney at his side, his face pale but unyielding. He had faced hostile boardrooms, billion-dollar losses, ruthless competitors, but never this. The collapse of his marriage, the betrayal of his oldest friend, the custody of his daughter hanging by a thread. Each step weighed like iron, but inside his chest, one truth gave him strength. Lily would not grow up under lies. Grace entered separately, guided by Samuel. She wore a modest navy dress, her braids neatly pinned. Her hands trembled, but her eyes held quiet fire. She had agreed to testify only if necessary, her heart torn between fear and duty. She knew courts had never been kind to women like her, women of color, women of service, But she also knew Lily needed someone unafraid to speak truth, no matter the cost. Inside, the courtroom hummed with whispers. Spectators packed the benches. Journalists scribbled furiously. At the front, the judge adjusted his glasses, his expression a mask of impartial gravity. Victoria sat at the plaintiff's table, draped in black silk, a pearl necklace around her throat. She had dressed the part of the grieving mother, her face pale, her lips trembling with carefully rehearsed sorrow. Beside her sat Robert, though technically he was not on trial, yet. His attorney whispered in his ear, reminding him that financial crimes had a way of bleeding into custody cases. The judge called the case Harrington versus Harrington, Custody and Protective Orders. Victoria's attorney stood first, his voice rich with false conviction. Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Harrington, is a devoted mother. She has been maligned by rumors and by the testimony of servants whose motives are questionable. We will show that Mrs. Harrington is the rightful guardian of Lily, and that Mr. Harrington's allegations are both vindictive and unsupported. Grace flinched at the word servants. The disdain was sharp, deliberate. James's attorney rose next, placing a USB drive carefully on the table. Your Honor, what we present today is not rumor. It is evidence. Surveillance footage, financial records, and testimony that reveal not only infidelity, but fraud and deliberate attempts to frame an innocent woman. We will show that Mrs. Harrington endangered her child and colluded with Mr. Robert Carraway in siphoning millions from the Harrington Family Trust. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge adjusted his glasses. Proceed. The first exhibit was the koi pond footage. The grainy video filled the courtroom screens, Grace holding Lily, the slap, the shove, the fall. Lily's cry pierced the silence. The jurors shifted uneasily. Victoria's attorney objected, taken out of context, but the judge allowed it. Next came the hallway recording. Victoria in her robe, Robert's hand at her waist, their whispered voices carrying, "He'll never know unless she talks." Victoria's face blanched. Robert looked down, his jaw tight. The courtroom buzzed like a hive disturbed. Finally, the USB, spreadsheets, emails, forged signatures, transfers from the family trust. The evidence of fraud sprawled across the screens, cold numbers damning in their clarity. Victoria's composure cracked. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering frantically. Robert's hands clenched into fists, his charm stripped away. Then Grace was called to the stand. She rose slowly, her heart hammering. She took the oath, her right hand trembling slightly, and sat. The courtroom eyes weighed heavy on her, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. I was hired to care for Lily. I never wanted anything but her safety. When she choked, I helped her breathe again. When she cried, I held her. And when I saw what I saw, Mrs. Harrington with Mr. Carraway, the plans they made, I stayed silent because I feared for Lily, not myself. Victoria's attorney smirked. Isn't it true, Miss Johnson, that you lost your own child, and that you transferred that grief onto Lily, confusing the line between caretaker and mother? The words sliced like knives. Grace's eyes filled, but she lifted her chin. Yes, I lost my son, Marcus. He died because poverty closed doors to us that wealth would have opened. That pain is mine to carry. But love is not confusion. Sir, love is what saved Lily when her own mother's hand struck me instead of holding her. The courtroom stilled. Even the judge's eyes softened briefly. When she stepped down, James's gaze met hers across the room. He inclined his head, silent but resolute. Victoria finally took the stand. Her tears flowed, her voice trembling with carefully rehearsed anguish. I was afraid that Grace was overstepping, that she wanted to replace me. Everything I did was for Lily. But the footage spoke louder than her words. The emails, the forged transfers, the conspiracies, they unraveled her testimony thread by thread. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. "Mrs. Harrington, this court has little patience for performance. Evidence weighs heavier than words." By late afternoon, the verdict came. The court granted James full custody of Lily with immediate effect. Victoria's parental rights were suspended pending investigation. Robert was referred to the district attorney for fraud charges and possible conspiracy. Restraining orders were issued to keep both away from the child. Victoria gasped, a sound between rage and despair. Robert cursed under his breath. Cameras flashed from the gallery as the gavel struck. James closed his eyes briefly, a tide of relief washing through him. When he opened them, he looked first to Grace. She stood at the back, Samuel beside her, her hands clasped as if in prayer. She met his gaze, and for a moment the noise of the courtroom faded. Outside, reporters swarmed, questions flying like arrows. James ignored them. He carried Lily in his arms, her tiny head resting against his shoulder. Grace walked a step behind, steady, protective. The reckoning had come, not only in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who had lived too long under masks. For the first time, the path ahead was uncertain, but it was honest. And that was enough. The first light of morning crept over the Harrington estate, spilling gold across the manicured lawns and the koi pond where everything had begun. The house, once filled with whispers and lies, stood quiet now, as if exhaling after a storm. The air smelled of wet earth and roses, the promise of summer mingling with the freshness of rain. Inside, the staff moved gently, their footsteps light, their voices hushed. They knew the household had changed. The masks had been torn away, the false queen and her conspirator cast out. What remained was fragile but real, a family learning to breathe again. Grace rose early, as she always did. Yet this morning felt different. There was no dread waiting for her in the halls, no venom hidden in Victoria's voice. She walked to the nursery, her heart lighter. Lily stirred as she entered, her tiny arms stretching, her curls sticking in wild tufts. "Good morning, little one," Grace whispered, scooping her into her arms. Lily nestled close, sighing in that innocent way children did, a sound more healing than any sermon. For years, Grace had carried grief like a stone in her chest, the death of Marcus, the poverty that had stolen him from her. But here, in Lily's laughter, she felt something shift. Pain did not disappear, but it softened, making room for new life. James stood in the doorway, watching. He wore no suit, no tie, only a simple shirt, the sleeves rolled. He looked different, stripped of the armor he had worn for so long. "You always know how to calm her," he said softly. Grace turned, startled but smiled faintly. "Children know who loves them." James stepped forward, his expression unguarded. "Grace, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my gratitude, my daughter's life, her trust, her smile. Those belong to you as much as they do to me." Her eyes glistened. "I only did what any mother would do." He hesitated, then spoke with a quiet conviction. "You are more of a mother than she ever was." The words hung in the air, tender and raw. Grace's throat tightened. For so long she had been the maid, invisible, doubted, despised. Now she was being seen, not as a servant, but as family. Later that morning, James gathered the entire staff in the great hall. The chandeliers glittered above them, but the mood was not formal. It was human. Grace stood to the side, holding Lily, unsure why she had been summoned. James faced them all, his voice steady but humble. For too long I let pride and blindness govern this house. I failed to see the truth, failed to protect those who served with loyalty and honor, especially Grace. He turned to her, his gaze unwavering. Before you all, I say this. She is no longer merely a caretaker. She is family. She is Lily's second mother. And from this day forward, she will be treated as such. The hall fell silent. Then Samuel, the old butler, bowed his head. It is only right, sir. Others murmured agreement, relief washing over their faces. They too had lived under Victoria's tyranny. They too longed for light. Grace's eyes filled, her voice trembling. Mr. Harrington, James, I don't know what to say. Say nothing, he replied gently. Just stay. That afternoon, James led Grace and Lily into the garden. The roses were in bloom, their petals opening to the sun. They sat together on a bench, the river glimmering in the distance. Lily toddled between them, clutching a small stuffed bear, her laughter ringing like bells. James leaned back, his eyes on the horizon. I used to think life was about winning, about power, appearances, control. But none of that matters when the people closest to you betray you. What matters is who remains when the storm clears. Grace looked at him, her voice quiet. What remains is love. Simple, ordinary love. He nodded, his gaze softening. That's all I want now. A life that is ordinary but honest. For me, for Lily, for you, if you'll allow it. Grace's breath caught. She turned her face toward the sun, letting its warmth kiss her skin. I never wanted riches, James. Only a chance to live without fear, to give a child what I couldn't give my son. Then we'll give her that, he said firmly. Together. The three of them lingered in the garden until evening. The koi pond shimmered once more, but now its waters reflected peace, not humiliation. Grace sat with Lily on her lap, James beside them, and for the first time, the estate felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Weeks passed. The legal battles continued in the background. Robert under indictment for fraud, Victoria stripped of her rights and reputation. Reporters still circled, hungry for scandal. But inside the Harrington estate, healing quietly unfolded. James no longer spent endless hours in Manhattan. He chose mornings with Lily over markets, evenings in the garden over boardrooms. He discovered laughter again. Real laughter, not the hollow kind reserved for shareholders. Grace flourished, too. She still helped with the house, but her role had transformed. She read to Lily in the library, taught her songs from her own childhood, walked with her along the riverbank. The staff, once distant, now looked to her with respect, no longer as a maid, but as a matriarch of the household. One late afternoon, James found Grace sitting beneath the willow by the water, Lily asleep in her arms. The setting sun bathed them in gold, their silhouettes framed in light. He paused, overcome by the sight. The woman who had endured loss and cruelty, now cradling his daughter as if she were her own. Grace, he said softly. She looked up, her smile tired but radiant. She finally fell asleep. He sat beside her, the grass cool beneath them. Do you know what I see when I look at you? She shook her head gently. I see strength, he said. A strength I didn't know existed. You've given me back more than I lost. You've given me the courage to live differently. Her eyes shone with quiet tears. And you've given me a place to belong again. The river whispered beside them, carrying away the echoes of betrayal, carrying forward the promise of renewal. As the stars emerged above Greenwich, Grace leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. Lily stirred, sighed, then settled again, her tiny hand clutching Grace's dress. And for the first time in years, James felt whole. Not as a CEO, not as a betrayed husband, but as a father, and as a man who had found family where he least expected it. The past had been a cage, but dawn had broken. And in that dawn, 3 souls sat together by the water, the light of truth and love rising steady, unstoppable, eternal. The story closes with a new dawn, where truth and love finally prevail. Not wealth or power, but kindness, trust, and compassion are what truly hold a family together. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story touched your heart, please hit subscribe so you won't miss the next healing and inspiring stories we share.